Welcome to the second part of our documentary about the Star of Bethlehem. If you have not yet seen the first part, please watch it first. You can find the link to the first video in the description below. After we have dealt intensively with the dating and the historical events surrounding the birth of Jesus, in this video we now want to talk about the foreign visitors, the wise men from the east. Where did they come from? Why were they watching the skies? And why did they make the long journey to Bethlehem? Depending on the translation of the scriptures, they are said to have been wise men, magicians, stargazers, or astrologers. We know that the legend of the three kings, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, is based on them. However, the Bible does not speak of kings, nor does it say anything about their number. Let's study the Gospel of Matthew, the earliest reference to the visitors from the east. This text is placed first in the New Testament, and for a long time it was assumed that it could be the oldest of the four synoptic Gospels. Today, however, researchers believe that the Gospel of Mark was written down first, several years before the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. According to scientific evidence, the Gospel of Matthew probably was written between the years 80 and 90, and thus about 15 to 25 years later than the Gospel of Mark. The Gospels are therefore not to be seen as contemporary witness accounts, because their writing began at the very earliest 30 years after the death of Jesus. The text of the Gospel that has come down to us was originally written in ancient Greek script, and the author probably used the Gospel of Mark as a template, since many passages are very similar. Unfortunately, we know almost nothing about the author. For centuries, the Church thought that it was the Apostle Saint Matthew, who was a former Roman tax collector. More recent theories, however, see in the evangelist Matthew, another person who never met Christ personally. Some researchers suggest that he was a Jew, who converted to Christianity and preached in a church in Antioch in Syria. This assumption is made because the disciple Saint Matthew, who was an eyewitness of the presence of Jesus, would certainly not have based his account on the writings of another, namely Mark, who in return never met Jesus in person. In fact, Matthew adopted about 600 of Mark's 661 verses almost literally. However, the second chapter with the Star of Bethlehem and the visit of the wise men is not one of them. Unfortunately, these events occur only in Matthew's Gospel. Perhaps the author also made use of another source, of which the evangelists Luke and Mark must also have had knowledge. But this mysterious text, which historians call the Q source, has not been preserved. A characteristic feature of Matthew's Gospel is that the author often referred to prophecies from the Old Testament. One example is the birth of the Messiah in the city of David, Bethlehem, foretold by the prophet Micah, almost quoted literally by Matthew in chapter 2, verse 6. Also, in many other passages of the Gospel it seems that one of Matthew's main intentions was to see old promises fulfilled. Some of the oldest known copies of the Gospel of Matthew are found in Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. These ancient Bible manuscripts date from the middle of the 4th century and are today considered the most important handwritings in the world. They both represent the most substantial books we possess from antiquity. Since 2009, the entire transcription of the Codex Sinaiticus has been available for viewing in full extent on the internet, where the crucial passages of Matthew's Gospel can be viewed in the original Greek version, written down about 1,600 years ago. Unfortunately, of all places, this passage with the second chapter is badly faded in the original manuscript. Much better preserved are the numerous copies of the Codex Vaticanus. Since this text is the older of the two codices, let us take a closer look at it. This is the key part of the second chapter, verse 1 to verse 2, taken from a facsimile of the Codex Vaticanus, where the visitors from the east and the Star of Bethlehem are mentioned for the first time. The original text names the visitors here Magoi Apo Anatolon. Translated, Magi of the Ascents, or Magi of the Risings. Here, with Magi, a strange term or name appears, that we cannot easily translate. This ancient Greek word is written, Magoi, but the correct pronunciation is, Magi. Possibly, earlier translators were not sure of the meaning, and so they created artificial terms from it, such as Magos, Magus or Magi. Ascent or rising means the astronomical direction east. About the star is written shortly after. Adomen, Gar, Autu, Ton, Astera. We have seen his star. Aster is the Greek word for star, which is found today in terms such as astronomy or astrology. After that comes immediately Te Anatole. In the risings, or in the east. A rising star. Anatole, as well as Anatolon, was not only used for the celestial direction east, but also for the sunrise, and later as a term for eastern countries, from which also the Turkish Anatolia is derived. If we now repeat Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 to 2, literally according to the original Greek version, it sounds like this. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, in the days of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem and said, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews? We have seen his star rising in the east and have come to worship him." Now it is spoken of Magi from the east. And they obviously had astronomical knowledge because they speak of a rising star. The exact meaning of the word Magi is still unclear. It is often translated as wise man or priest. The modern terms magic and magician also derive from this root. Magi is the plural of the Greek word magios. In modern Greek, magios and magi mean sorcerer or magician. The linguistic origin of these terms used today in modern Greek is obviously in the word magi, mentioned by Matthew. But it does not seem to be an original ancient Greek term, but rather a name. Well, the questions are, where did this name originally come from, and what does it mean? The earliest known use of the word magi is found in the trilingual Behistun inscription, written around 500 BC, by order of the Persian king Darius the Great. The name also appears, in different forms of spelling, in later Persian and Hellenistic texts. Moreover, the wise men from the east have always been called magi in English, which is nothing more than a verbalization of the ancient Greek name, magi. But how many magi were there? And why are they often depicted as kings today? Matthew does not report how many visitors there were, but perhaps because of the three gifts mentioned in the Gospel, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, it was simply assumed that they were three people. Nor does the biblical text mention that they were rulers or kings. However, frankincense and myrrh are precious resins that were used for cultic purposes. They were often ingredients of oils, with which kings were ritually anointed. However, there are also many other symbolic interpretations of the three gifts, which we cannot reflect all here. Anyway, it wasn't too long before the Magi became the three kings, who were also portrayed as such on countless displays of religious art. However, this is not yet the case in some of the earliest depictions, such as this one from the 9th century. The visitors do not wear royal crowns here, but strange caps. The earliest known depictions are particularly interesting, like this one in the Domitilla Catacomb in Rome. The fresco dates from the early 3rd century and differs even more from the later norm. It is also perhaps one of the oldest depictions of the Virgin Mary discovered so far. Mary is enthroned with the child on her lap, a clear reference to pagan representations of the Egyptian goddess Isis with her son Horus. She appears to be seated in a magnificent hall, suggested by the draped fabrics in the background, and she is obviously receiving visitors. But there are 4 people approaching her from both sides, not 3. And again, it is remarkable, they also wear these strange caps instead of crowns. More early Christian frescoes, throughout you can see the characteristic headdress. It is the so-called Phrygian cap, which was widely used in the Middle East at that time, especially by the Persians, Parthians, and other peoples east of Palestine. Also, on mosaics and reliefs of late antiquity, the visitors wear clothes that were typical for the population east of the Holy Land. Pants and robes, like those shown here, also clearly point to the Middle East, as does the Phrygian cap. It has been claimed that the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem was not destroyed after the Persian conquest in the year 615, only because the conquerors, seeing the mosaics there, recognized their compatriots by their clothing and refrained from plundering. Later, in the early Middle Ages, towards the end of the 10th century, the tradition of depicting the visitors as kings became more common in representations of church art. The visitors now wear crowns and royal robes and occasionally appear with a royal entourage. Some historians suspect that the church leaders of the High Middle Ages did not want to accept that pagan astrologers, magicians, and soothsayers were supposed to have been witnesses to the birth of Jesus. The early 3rd century Roman church writer Tertullian is therefore said to have claimed that they appeared like kings. Also, there are several passages in the Old Testament in which it is foretold that there will be kings who pay homage to the Savior. This is particularly clear in Psalm 72, verse 10. Kings of foreign nations submit to the true king and bring tribute to him, just as was the practice in ancient times with subdued rulers. The following verse of this psalm also states, "Let all kings bow in homage to him, all nations serve him." In the art of the High Middle Ages, the 3 kings were often depicted as a youth, an adult man, and an old man. This probably symbolized the 3 ages of man. Until the end of the 15th century, people in the Western Christian world believed that the earth consisted of the 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. As a result, the view that the 3 kings symbolized these 3 continents became increasingly popular in the late Middle Ages. The representative of Africa was often depicted with black skin, a tradition that has been preserved in many nativity plays to this day. Their legendary names, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, appeared in different variations from the 6th century onwards and are even older than the tradition of the 3 kings itself. Of course, the relics of the Holy Kings should also be mentioned here, housed in this magnificent shrine in Cologne Cathedral. Saint Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine, is said to have found and took with her the remains of the kings on a pilgrimage in Palestine around the year 326. When the German Emperor Barbarossa burned down the city of Milan in 1164, he had the relics brought to the city of Cologne. This laid the foundation for the building of the Cologne Cathedral, where the relics are kept and venerated today. When the shrine was opened in 1864, it was found out to contain the remains of various persons, including even those of a child, so it was impossible to make a specific attribution. However, as with most bone relics, these remains are most likely not from the saints to whom the reliquary is attributed. The church reformer Martin Luther, who did not believe in relics at all, was not well disposed towards the 3 kings. We might say the Star of Bethlehem contributed indirectly, however modestly, to the Protestant Reformation. Luther repeatedly opposed what he saw as foolish popular belief, for example in his interpretation of the Epistles and Gospels, published in 1530. For example, he wrote, "Those whom the evangelist here calls magos, we call in German the soothsayers. These magicians or wise men were not kings but were learned and experienced people with knowledge of nature." Luther adds that only the simple-minded can believe that the wise men could have been kings, and that there is no reference to their number in the Gospel either. In Luther's last translation of the Bible from 1545, similar comments by the Reformer are even inserted into the text of the Gospel. He noted, "Those whom Saint Matthew calls magos have been naturalists and priests." Let us return to the Magi, of whom the original Greek text speaks. So far, we know who they were not. But we still don't know exactly who they were. Ancient Greek historians like Herodotus, Strabon and Philon of Alexandria may give us a hint. They report on a caste, or tribe of priests from Media, an ancient land in what is now Iran. These priests were attributed mystical abilities, from astrology to fortune-telling and even necromancy. They were called Magu, Mogu, or Magupat. The Magu were known in the ancient world, but their name already had negative connotations. Ancient scholars, like Heraclitus, Pliny, and Plutarch, were critical towards the Magu. For example, Heraclitus, who lived in the 6th century BC, cursed the Magu for their impious rites and rituals. This may have led to the rejection and fear of sorcerers, and it is hardly surprising that natural scholars like these were repeatedly suspected of witchcraft for centuries. Their name became the epitome of sorcery. Magicians. Historians believe that the Magu priests belonged to an ancient religion that still exists today, the Zoroastrianism. This assumption is based on references found in the Avesta, the oldest collection of Zoroastrian texts, which dates to the 9th or 10th century BC. In fact, this religion is one of the oldest faiths in the world. It probably originated around 1500 BC in the East Iranian highlands and spread from Persia throughout Central Asia from the 7th to the 4th century BC. Zoroastrianism is based on the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster, who is also called Zarathustra. Some authors even suggest that Zoroaster himself belonged to the priestly caste of the Magu. The supreme divinity of the Zoroastrian religion, the benevolent deity of wisdom, Ahura Mazda, was also raised to the principal deity of the Persians. Zoroastrianism is basically a monotheistic religion, or rather, it is characterized by the dualism of Ahura Mazda and his adversary, an evil demon called Engramenyu, or Ahriman. However, this often depicted winged figure does not represent Ahura Mazda, as is often claimed. It is the so-called Faravahar, a Zoroastrian emblem that symbolizes the human spirit. The Assyrians used a very similar symbol, the winged sun, to represent their principal deity, Assur. Some historians believe that ancient Judaism was strongly influenced by Zoroastrianism during the Babylonian captivity in the 6th to 4th centuries BC. The Book of Daniel and many other texts of the Jewish Bible were probably written during this period of exile. As is well known, the Old Testament is marked by the Jews' rejection of other religions, especially idolatry. But they did not seem at all hostile to Zoroastrianism. In fact, this faith has many features that are familiar to us from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For example, monotheism and messianism, resurrection and afterlife, the dualism of good and evil, the concept of heaven and hell, angels, and demons. According to some authors, the Israelites may have found here a faith that was related to their own. This may even have gone so far that some exiled Jews equated Ahura Mazda with the god of Israel and Engram with the devil. However, all this took place about 500 to 600 years before the birth of Jesus. The golden age of the Medes was long gone, but the ancient art of astrology was still practiced in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Therefore, some historians see the origin of the wise men in what Iran is now. This region, including the Zagros Mountains and the Iran-Iraq border region, the former empire of the Medes, was under the rule of the Parthians at the time of Jesus' birth. Especially the city of Ecbatana, today called Hamadan, is often mentioned in this context. It was the capital of the ancient empire of the Medes and for centuries a stronghold of astrology. There was also a Jewish community there. Other historians assume the home of the Magi instead to be several hundreds of miles to the southwest, beyond the Zagros Mountains, in Babylon. Babylon was the main city of the former Babylonian Empire and once the largest town of Mesopotamia, as the fertile plain between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers is called, in what is now Iraq, not far from today's Iraqi capital Baghdad. Based on the earlier Sumerian city-states, one of the most important ancient civilizations emerged here. And it was also, long before the Medes, a center of astronomy and astrology. By the time of Jesus, however, the city and the empire of Babylon had long since fallen into insignificance, as well as the ancient empire of the Medes. But their descendants still lived in these lands. It is by no means the same whether the astrologers were descendants of the Medes or the Babylonians. Even the Church Fathers made a clear distinction here. Origen, the church teacher mentioned before, in his writing against the philosopher Celsus, rejects the latter's opinion that the worshippers of the Jesus boy were Chaldeans, as the Babylonians have also been called. In fact, the Bible portrays the Babylonians and Assyrians with their numerous gods very negatively, quite in contrast to the Persians and Medes. In the Old Testament, Babylon is considered the epitome of idolatry. Instead, as mentioned earlier, the Persians and Medes were probably considered to be worshippers of the same god as the Jews. For some researchers, the name Magi is clear geographical evidence that the astrologers came from Medo-Iran and belonged to the priestly caste of the Magu. But it is disputed whether the Magi were from the beginning followers of Zoroaster. Rather, it appears that they constituted a priesthood serving several religions. There is much evidence that this caste of priests still existed during the Seleucid and Parthian periods and into the Sasanian era. In other words, even long after the time of Jesus' birth. However, it is possible that they made use of the ancient astrological knowledge of the Babylonians. Babylonia was conquered by the Persian king Cyrus II in 539 BC, and so Babylonian astrology came to the Medes. However, these assumptions are anything but proven facts. The Medes left no written sources, quite unlike the Babylonians. The only references to their history are archaeological findings, Assyrian and Babylonian text sources, and the accounts of ancient Greek writers. And the Medes and their capital Ecbatana are also mentioned in biblical texts. The book of Tobit from the Apocrypha is partly set there, as are the books of Judith and Esther. Flavius Josephus also reports that the prophet Daniel lived for a time in Ecbatana when he was the king's principal advisor. The relationship between the Medes and the neighboring Babylonians was not always easy. Sometimes they were allies, sometimes they fought each other as bitter enemies. When the Medes allied with the Babylonians, they together conquered and sacked the Assyrian city of Nineveh in 612 BC. But later, the Medes made territorial claims against their powerful neighbors. Therefore, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II had a wall built between the Euphrates and the Tigris. It was over 100 kilometers long, 30 meters high, and 6 meters thick. This became possible because the ancient Babylonians were exceptionally skilled builders. For centuries, Babylon was the largest and most beautiful city in the world and the center of one of the most advanced civilizations, as early as around 4,000 years ago under the great king Hammurabi. Babylon is also where the Hanging Gardens are said to have been built, described by Greek writers, and today considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Later on, along with Persepolis, it was also one of the main cities of the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great, who marched into Babylon after his victory over the Persian king Darius III in 330 BC, made the city the capital of his empire, and he also died here. One of the most significant differences between the Babylonians and the Medes was their religion. The Babylonians had more than 1,000 gods, some of which they had adopted from the Sumerians and Akkadians. For example, the Babylonian fertility goddess, Ishtar, was almost entirely identical with the Sumerian goddess of love, Inanna. In Sumerian times, the highest god was An, the Lord of Heaven. Next to him ruled Enki, Lord of Water, and Enlil, Lord of Earth, who was called Bel by the Babylonians and Baal by the Phoenicians. An ancient Babylonian legend tells that Bel appointed the goddess of fertility, Ishtar, the moon god, Sin, and the sun god, Shamash, as guardians of the heavens. Since then, they have been patrolling the sky as Venus, the moon, and the sun. They became the 3 astral gods of the Babylonians. The Babylonians moved their deities to the heavens, one by one, transferring their mythical qualities to the planets. A deed that cannot be admired enough. For the first and only time, a religion made its gods visible and, above all, predictable, by identifying them with the celestial bodies. Their power was symbolized by the planets, their nature was revealed, their influence on mankind became readable. The urge to do so is already evident in the Sumerian and Babylonian writing, the cuneiform script. Because the ancient Sumerian cuneiform character for deity was a star. Later, the ancient Greeks simply copied the Babylonian pantheon. They turned Ishtar into their goddess of love, Aphrodite, who was called Venus by the Romans. Greeks and Romans also associated their fertility goddesses with the planet Venus, the bright morning and evening star. The deed of Bel was repeated, as other planets were associated with gods. Marduk, Babylon's imperial god, who was usually depicted in human shape with his dragon, Mashushu, was associated with the planet Jupiter, which Marduk wears as a star image on his robe. Marduk was considered the creator of the universe, the god of light and life, and attained such importance that he was given 50 different names. In Hebrew he was called Merodach. For the Greeks, he became Zeus, the father of the gods, who was later called Jupiter by the Romans. Another deity that will interest us along with Marduk was Ninurta, also known as Ningirsu, or Ninib. Originally, he was a war god from the Sumerian and Assyrian mythology. According to some authors, the Babylonians identified Ninurta with the planet Saturn, who was Kronos, for the Greeks. Therefore, it is often assumed that Ninurta could be identical with an idol god mentioned in the Old Testament, whose idolatry is cursed by the prophet Amos. Depending on the translation of the scripture, this idol is called Kaiwan, Kiwan, or Kijun. These names in turn may be derived from Kaiwanu, a deity name mentioned in ancient Akkadian inscriptions. The interesting point for us is, that the book of Amos also refers to Kaiwan as the star god or the star of your God. In addition, he is mentioned together with another idol, who is named Sakhet or Sikhet. This name is not clearly classifiable from a historical point of view. Some authors assume that Sakhet could be another name for Marduk or Jupiter because Amos additionally refers to Sakhet as king. Others, however, believe that Sakhet and Kaiwan could be interchangeable names for the same star god, referring to Saturn. However, regardless of the biblical narrative, it is historically proven that the Babylonians had a religious relation to the planets. That is why astronomy was an essential element of their religion. They developed a religious cult around the stars. The study of the celestial bodies was the highest form of religious practice. For this reason, astrologers were also priests. The priest performed the highest religious rite by observing the planets and studying their movements and relationships to each other. The Babylonians are therefore considered the first real celestial explorers. They preserve chronicles of their astronomical observations in their archives that date back to the 3rd millennium before Christ. Thousands of clay tablets in cuneiform writing contain astronomical texts and calculations, as well as astrological interpretations and reports to their king. Among the 25,000 clay tablets of the library in Nineveh, about 7,000 omen signs were found, and the first records of this kind date back to the time of the Akkadian king Sargon, in 2800 BC. The Babylonians also created their calendar according to astronomical calculations. The 7-day week we still use today also comes from the Babylonians. They also invented the zodiac, even though the signs we know today are very different from those of the Babylonians. The priest-astronomers developed mathematical series that made it possible to calculate the positions of the celestial bodies and predict planetary positions, as well as solar and lunar eclipses. Thus, at the same time as astrology, the Babylonians developed a calculating astronomy. Both were mutually dependent and inseparable. All of this served the sole purpose of refining the astrological predictions, on which the well-being of the ruler and the entire empire depended. The largest building between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers may have been both a temple and an astronomical observatory. The so-called Itemenenki, the house of the foundations of heaven and earth, described by Herodotus, was a ziggurat. This is the name of the typical temple towers, built by Babylonians, Sumerians, and Akkadians for religious purposes. It is still unclear when exactly the tower was first built. It is believed that the structure already existed in the 2nd millennium BC. In the meantime, it was destroyed by Assyrian conquerors and by earthquakes, and was rebuilt in the 7th century BC. The Blue Temple on its rooftop was dedicated to the imperial god Marduk. From here, the priest-astronomers possibly observed the course of the planets for their astrological predictions. After the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, it was probably the 4th tallest building of the ancient world. In most historical sources, the height of the Itemenenki is given as more than 90 meters. More recent research, however, casts doubt on this, especially for structural reasons. Instead, a height of 60 or 70 meters is considered more likely. Even though the tower is long gone, it is still possible to see from space where it once stood. Today, satellite images show 4 water-filled channels that form the outline of the foundations. Some researchers see the Itemenenki as an inspiration for the biblical narrative of the Tower of Babel from the Old Testament. The Jewish exiles may have seen the tower being rebuilt or even completed during the Babylonian captivity. It is believed that they could not understand the true function and meaning of the tower because they lacked any connection to the study of the stars, as they could not comprehend the Babylonians' interest in astrology. Therefore, it is not surprising when the Bible tells of the people of Babel, who built a tower to reach heaven, and were punished by God for it. Because of man's haughtiness, God brought the building of the tower to a halt by causing a confusion of languages that forced the abandonment of the building and scattered those who were building it all over the earth. This profound misunderstanding is certainly due to the prohibition of the worship of celestial bodies in the Jewish Bible. The book of Deuteronomy makes this clear in unmistakable way. According to the Genesis, man was created in the image of God. The celestial bodies were subordinated to man, and therefore these could not have the power to guide his destiny. There is also a clear warning to be read by the prophet Jeremiah. The prohibition of astrology also included astronomy, which was mainly concerned with calendar calculation. Regardless, there is an ancient Hebrew calendar, which is still used today for Jewish religious observance, and as an official calendar of the State of Israel. Obviously, despite the prohibition, the Jewish people studied the signs of the stars and made horoscopes. Even Flavius Josephus, the biographer of King Herod, reports that the art of astrology was widely spread among his people. The only thing was not to get caught. And indeed, it was Jewish astrologers who came up with probably the most interesting answer to the question about the Star of Bethlehem in the Middle Ages. But more about that later. Back to the Babylonians, of whom the Bible, as mentioned, does not give too favorable a picture. This is, of course, due to the historical period already mentioned, which is very important in the Old Testament and for the Jewish people. Namely, the conquest and occupation of Jerusalem by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II between 597 and 587 BC. The Bible refers to this age of captivity mainly in the book of Daniel. Thousands of people, especially members of the upper class, were deported to Babylon, and during this time of oppression, people grew hope for a savior, the Messiah. As a matter of fact, most of the writings of the Old Testament were written during this period, or in the post-exilic time. This leads some authors to believe that the stargazers from the Gospel of Matthew were descendants of these once deported Jews. In Babylon, as in Ecbatana, there was a Jewish community since that time. The exiles are said to have remained in the land between Euphrates and Tigris, where they kept alive the Jewish faith and the expectations of salvation of their people. But they also kept up the old Babylonian knowledge about the stars. But if we look again at the text in Matthew, we discover a clue that speaks against this theory, because the text says they were looking for the King of the Jews. This is an expression Jews themselves would never use. If the visitors from the east had been Jews themselves, they would probably have been looking for the King of Israel, rather than the King of the Jews. As already mentioned, neither the Empire of Babylonia nor the Empire of the Medes still existed at the time of Jesus' birth. Both were now dominions of the Parthians, with whom Rome was constantly at war, not least because of trade interests. Many military conflicts marked the relationship between the two empires, with the Parthians usually being the ones attacked. The Parthian Empire was the dominant power in the Middle East in the 1st century BC and the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And during this time, they were among the fiercest enemies of Rome. The ruler of the Parthian Empire at the time of Jesus' birth was Great King Phraates IV. And some authors suggest that even if the stargazers, wise men, magi or magi were not kings themselves, it could have been this king who sent them or at least allowed them to travel. According to a related theory, The Magi may even have been representatives of the Parthian government, and they arrived with a large entourage of armed men to accompany them on their journey to Jerusalem. This is sometimes used to explain Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, according to which all Jerusalem was deeply disturbed. The arrival of a large retinue of armed Parthians must certainly have been alarming for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Regardless of who sent them, and whether or not they came with a convoy of guards, in any case, it would have been a long journey to get to Judea. Over 1,000 kilometers, which would have required at least 2 months of journey on camels or horses, if they had to come from Babylon. From the Iranian highlands, the journey would probably have taken another month, as their path would inevitably have led through the Zagros Mountains. If they indeed were members of the Mado-Iranian priest caste called Magu, their route from Ecbatana through the Zagros may have led them first to the Mesopotamian plain. They may have joined one of the trade caravans that traveled between the eastern cities and the Mediterranean coast. Together with the caravan, they may have followed a route that took them several hundred kilometers along the Euphrates River in a northwesterly direction, and then westward along the edge of the Syrian desert to reach Palmyra. The oasis of Palmyra was one of the most important trading locations in the Orient in Roman times. After that, the caravan may have continued in a southwesterly direction to the city of Damascus, which, like Palmyra, was already under Roman control. Possibly the caravan passed the border of the Roman Empire away from the road, so as not to be controlled by Roman patrols. From Damascus, it would have been another journey of several days in a southwesterly direction along the Jordan Rift Valley, to Jerusalem, the capital of Judea. Since they had to assume that a king was going to be born at the royal court, the travelers first appeared here before King Herod and asked him about the new king. After their stay, they continued to Bethlehem, which is just a few miles south of Jerusalem. In a few hours they would have arrived at their destination. Matthew reports that the wise men took a different route back. According to some authors, their way home led them to the famous rock city of Petra, in today's Jordan. Others claim that their journey to Bethlehem already led them to Petra, because the Nabateans living here traded in precious resins, such as myrrh and frankincense. Two of the gifts that the wise men brought, according to the Gospel. However, if their journey took this southern route, they would have to cross the open northern Arabian desert, which seems very unlikely. Well, for now, we have also arrived at our destination. Thank you for watching. The third and last part of our documentary will finally deal with the question of what the Star of Bethlehem actually was. You will find the link to the third part, as well as to the first video, in the description below. Please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. We also appreciate your comments. See you soon and goodbye.